Hello, everyone. My name is Kathryn Schneider, and I am in the Art History Master's program here at TCU. Thank you for joining our session this evening. I'm joined by my fellow classmate, Emma Thompson, who's running our technology this evening. So thank you, Emma, for managing all of that. Tonight, we're hosting the final session of our educational programming for our faculty exhibition entitled Interpreting Renditions of Nature, Community, and Self. This exhibit presents 26 works of art by the artists of TCU's permanent faculty in the School of Art. The artworks in this exhibition represent the practices and interests of 11 individuals. Their art becomes modes of communication, and each artist offers a distinct voice as they explore their relationships with nature, community, and self. This evening's session focuses on our theme of community and is organized as a panel format. Following the prepared questions, we'll close with questions from the audience. So please submit your questions on the Facebook Live, and we'll get to those with about the last 10 minutes of the session. To lead our session this evening, we're joined by Sara-Jayne Parsons. As the director and curator of the art galleries at TCU in Fort Worth, Sara-Jayne Parsons produces international exhibitions at Fort Worth Contemporary Arts and promotes professional development of students and local artists through programming in Moudy Gallery. Her curatorial practice is informed by working in close partnership or collaboration with artists to produce new artworks through commissions, exhibitions, publications, and artists' residencies. Visiting artists she has worked with in this way at TCU include Sebastian Bremer, Buster Graybill, Cisco Merrill, and Emily Speed. Before moving to Fort Worth in 2014, Parsons was the exhibition's curator at the Blue Coat in Liverpool, United Kingdom, where she produced a diverse contemporary exhibition program. In that time, she was also a collaborative member of the curatorial team for the Liverpool Biennial. This is the largest international contemporary art festival in the UK, and director of Look, Liverpool's International Photography Festival. She has published critical writing in numerous exhibition catalogs in contemporary art magazines over the past 15 years, including Exposure, Source, and Art Monthly Australia. Currently pursuing doctoral studies, Parsons received an MA in art history from the University of North Texas and a BA in history of art and publishing from Oxford Brookes University. Welcome, Sara-Jayne. Our panelists tonight are Nick Bontrager, Associate Professor of Art, Jian, Assistant Professor of Art, Dick Lane, Director of the School of Art, Rachel Livedalen, Assistant Professor of Art, Dr. Mary Nangah, Art Education Instructor, Cam Schoepp, Professor of Art. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Sara-Jayne now to moderate our panel. So thanks, Sara-Jayne.
Thank you, Kathryn. And actually, before we begin, I really did want to extend my gratitude and say thank you to you and to your colleagues, to Emma, Hailey, Madeline, and Michelle. Thank you to the MA Art History grads for putting this wonderful exhibition together. I'm so grateful that Dr. Boehm, your mentor and your guide in this process, was up for this kind of project. I wasn't quite sure when we floated the idea of students working with our faculty in this way, what wonderful things would be revealed. And so I think it's been a great experience, and I've heard really wonderful complimentary comments from our faculty and people that have seen the exhibition. So congratulations to you, graduate students. We're really glad that you're able to do this. And also thank you so much to our faculty for participating in this. Again, it's turned into a really great exhibition, and I'm glad that we can really bring this to a close with this third and final panel. And thank you for all the arrangements on that, Kathryn and Emma in particular. So to talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about sort of my understanding of how the students have talked about the work of our faculty under this theme of community, that their understanding is that our faculty are making art, really exploring and understanding the human condition through community and really drawing on their own lived experience, as well as working with sort of recognized cultural objects, whether that's artworks or monuments or consumer products or brands. working with those things in terms of representing or representing aspects of their own community. But sometimes doing that in a way that's unrecognizable, that disrupts kind of norms, that challenges us to think about established ideas and symbols in a different way, and to kind of, maybe ask us to really think about what community means. So I think the grad students did an interesting job of sort of drawing out these ideas of community through different prisms that our faculty work really reflects on and explores. So in particular, say maybe Dan and Mary looking, through the prism of cultural identity in terms of what community can be or how it's understood. Rachel working with, in gender, working with aspects of feminism and womanhood. For Dick, the idea of family as community and kind of what that means in his photographic work. And then with Nick and Cam, I think, questions around technology, materials, experimentation and play and collaboration, and what community means kind of through that way of making art. And so I sort of, as we were working on the exhibition and the grads were putting it together and coming through with these ideas and these themes, and more particularly writing their exhibition catalog essay, I became so curious about the process and how they sort of grouped you artists together under the theme of community. And I'm really not sure it would have occurred to me in the same way if you'd asked me to make this show with faculty. I'm not sure I would have come up with this. So I was really excited to see the way that the grads were working. And I guess my first question for my faculty colleagues is, how do you feel about sort of the students' characterization of your work in this thematic sense in terms of community? And also, how do you define community in your work, kind of as a response back to the students? And any one of you who wants to jump in first.
I mean, I'll say something really quick, that the work I had in the show was part of a collaborative project, and it's two people I've worked with for now going on 35, almost 40 years. And the relationship that we've developed over that time to do these projects, there is this sense of belonging when you're with them, and it is a kind of unique experience in my art practice.
We should, for those people that have not had a chance to see the exhibition or engage with it, we're looking at images here of the model of the wall horn and your drawings, which is a collaborative sketch, I understand, that you all worked on that. Mm-hmm. And the book, the Jet Construction Collaborative Group, making the book together. And those are, I mean, just thinking about those objects in the exhibition, Cam, those are three very different ways of working, even through a collaboration. Could you talk about that a little bit, like how different those aspects are?
Well, and what has to be understood is the object actually was made and its orientation is actually horizontal, so it cantilevers out from the wall about 20 feet. And so all acts kind of lead towards that completed object. I think the outlier is the book, where we wanted to gather the process and record the process. And in a way, the book is laid out as a manual of how you could make your own. So all the information is there so that you could physically make your own wall horn. If one chose to, no one will, of course. But that's kind of the absurdity of the whole thing, is this very technically detailed, hundreds of pages of manual to build your own wall horn. We thought that was a great way to kind of record this whole event.
And I was going to say, that seems a really generous way to share with a wider community beyond your immediate way of working. Does somebody else like to jump in with a question? Rachel?
Sara-Jayne. Oh.
Sure. So I guess I don't usually think of my work in relationship to community. I think of it in relationship to culture. And this has been really interesting because I think personally, I think of culture sometimes as this like third entity, that it's me, it's other people, and then there's culture and we all contribute to it. And it was a nice way for me to reflect back on the fact that culture is shared in a community. I'm working with different iconography or symbols or references to cultural elements. The works in the show use some pop cultural elements as part of the visual language, and it's been fun hearing from some people who recognize them, right? So it is this like shared reference.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think in terms of popular cultural references as community, that makes me want to sort of pop over and talk to Nick about that, because I think with Nick's work in the show, we're talking about a very particular community, Nick. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, this work in the show is really focused on a larger project that's ongoing regarding arcades and game culture and game studies. And I think community is a really relevant point to touch on for this work, because it's specifically involving the architecture of an arcade cabinet. So thinking about that as this place where you can experience a very personal yet community-based moment that at the same time can be anonymous, and you're not necessarily worried about who is next to you or what their goals are, but at the same time you may be focused on creating a legacy in that moment, or the idea of putting your name on the high score list if it's a competitive experience for you, or if it's more passive where you're just a spectator in this moment. So these places that I was addressing with this work were just really important to me as somebody who was fairly introverted, did not live near the community I went to school. You know, single child or only child of a single parent, you know, so spending pretty much all my time in a book or in front of a screen. This was kind of a place where I could experience a little bit of community, at the same time not feel overwhelmed with a need to interact with another person.
Right. Certainly in the video arcade, you have options depending on the types of games you're going to play, and also how that transfers to digital gaming and communities, online communities that are formed now through different gaming platforms. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because I know that's like other things that you're interested in that are part of the work that you're doing.
That's a huge part of my interest in terms of contemporary gaming, but also historical gaming, the way that representation has shifted and changed throughout the history of gaming. The idea that you can become anyone in a game is certainly an aspect of the work that I'm making in this series, but also just in general goes back to that idea of, you know, the indoor kid, the person who is less likely to start a conversation with a new person when you can wear this mask and you know, don this avatar of becoming anything with no consequences. And so the connection to contemporary gaming or online gaming, yeah, those communities see huge swings where it becomes an outlet for somebody who has some kind of you know, emotional trauma or opposition to social interactions, but also can be where somebody now no longer has a filter and can freely spread hate speech and cause harm that they would feel that they would not want to do if they were face to face with that person. So it becomes this huge system of is censorship needed in various platforms, and how do you moderate it? Who is the moderator? And how do you determine representation when everybody is an avatar? And those are kind of some of the questions that I'm interested in, both in teaching and in my studio.
And so sort of like ethics, social responsibility, social justice, all those things that are part of your lived experience, everyday life, that still transforms into those digital communities through gaming. They're the same sorts of questions that come through in terms of community and communal living, I guess, even though it's online. And your mention of Avatar actually sort of makes me think of things transforming and identities transforming, and that sort of leads me to talking to Dan and like thinking, Dan, in your work of the sort of cultural objects and ideas that you're sort of playing with and abstracting and changing and giving a new narrative to. I see that the avatar transformation is kind of happening in your work as well. Could you talk a little bit about your response to the students' characterization of your work in community in this sense?
I think of a community similar to the phrase that Ken brought it up as a sense of belonging. And I think in my work, it's also loosely associated to sense of home in a way. While I hear Nick talk, and I was drawing association in terms of community is a forever evolving thing. And in my work, I think of it as a platform where things can travel, but the sense of belonging sort of has a free flow direction where you can circulate in a space, feel like you are a singular sign or a singular pictorial reference is supported by something that is larger. And that's an analogy that I like to draw in my work. By that, what I'm saying is a community is more of like the whiteness of the paper where things get associated and start pull reference and meaning from each other.
So those connections are made, or that dissonance is found, those kind of little tensions or rubs that we might find in everyday life coming through your materials.
Right. And I would like to add that community is also associated to, in my work, the sense of tradition. I felt like that's where I find my pictorial community, is by referencing things that are familiar but hard to pinpoint. But I get a sense of belonging through staring at it. So it might not be a social community, it's a vague and fragile kind of collected sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A collection of things. And that notion of belonging also opens up a conversation with Dick's work in terms of very sort of personal belonging, in terms of familial belonging. And certainly in a lot of the photographic work that you're doing, Dick, those are things that you're kind of reaching back into the past to bring to the present. But it's very much about community, a very personal, close, and more intimate community.
Yeah, it was, your original question about how did we feel about being in this group? It's like, I'd never really thought about myself being that in that kind of community thing. But honestly, going back to it, I mean, family for me is the very first community that was, part of who I am as an artist, and the support that I got from them. And a lot of the work in the most recent past has really been about sort of taking that family history and translating it through my photography. But it's always the idea of community is an interesting question, because I have to say, 99.9% of the time, the act of creation is a solitude for me. I'm just in my head, and nobody else is there with me except my other selves. When I'm out shooting, I'm out by myself. And really, in terms of a broader community, that doesn't happen until this work is created and we have exhibitions and things. So there's different points where that idea of community comes along. But, you know, just being able to sort of address family as a historical thing has been a really interesting journey for me in terms of this work, for sure.
And I can see how, yeah, there's probably like a struggle with some of that exploration. But I was sort of thinking too that photographers as a community are quite, you know, that's quite a strong sort of supportive group of practitioners, particularly like in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So yes. I don't know if that was something that you had thought about when I was thinking more broadly about photography and your practice. I was thinking about, you know, there's quite a large group of people in the area that would understand and subscribe to that community.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it was, we were in a meeting earlier today where our other photography faculty member talked about this organization that we belong to called the Society for Photographic Education, which has always been a really strong organization and really a built-in community for us. So, you know, we always have people we can go talk to about our work that we rely on in terms of sort of professional things. So yeah, that community, when I was in school as an undergraduate, was introduced to me really early. I became a part of that. So yeah, it's something that my other colleagues don't generally have very much.
I was going to say maybe Rachel in terms of printmaking, because there's quite a lot of collaborative work that happens there sometimes, and certainly Mary in teaching and through art education. That's certainly there's a community that works together there really closely. Yeah. And Mary, not to leave you out, please answer. Please, if you would like to chip in and respond to the question about how you feel about the thematic inclusion of community in your work.
Certainly. The theme of community, it's relevant, but also complicated in this body of work I'm working with. Thinking about the history of these objects, African art objects, of what we see in museums largely, and thinking about what the original context and community of which these objects existed in, and the displacement of community as well, right? Now they're in a different setting. Is there a community that takes in whatever new knowledge is created by this setting? Yes, there is. So the idea of community here is, it's tricky because I also think of myself as an immigrant, right? Originally from Cameroon. So there's that history of community from home, and there's a shift that occurs, and what's community here as well. So this body of work, it complicates those concepts, and that's, to me, that's a good thing, right? If the idea of a shifting of audience and a new narrative occurs, then where does the community really lie? Where is the authentic community? So if anything, it probably brings up more questions than it aims to answer.
So for you, it sort of problematizes and makes sort of for even a richer engagement with sort of the questions that you're asking as you're making these paintings.
Absolutely. And the fact that these are paintings which are have imagery that is recognizable as what we will see as African art, but they're paintings on canvas with oil. If you go to museums, if you go into these settings, the idea of belonging too is an issue, because technically they don't belong in that space. And who created that narrative of what belongs in the community of a gallery space, right? If we think about that space in itself as a community, who shapes the parameters and the norm of what that community is? Who is allowed in, who is not, whose voice counts, whose voice does not count?
Right, whose language is used, terminology, vocabulary, those kinds of questions around how that community is formed or understood or discussed or described, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm aiming to disrupt, but in the process still learn from myself, because it's complex.
Yeah. And it sounds like, you know, what I'm hearing from all of you is sort of like, some of you maybe understood a notion of community within your work, but maybe are looking at it afresh and in a different way. And some of you had not really thought about it in those terms at all. And now maybe that's kind of put a spotlight on an aspect of your work to consider in the future, perhaps. So thank you, grad students, for poking our faculty like that. That's always really useful. A kind of a follow-up question, but that's more broadly about community at the moment and of our time. And I was going to ask you a question about how the pandemic has affected your practice and your sense of community in your work. But then, of course, our ice storm came. So I should also ask you, more particularly with weather-related issues in Texas, being more of an emergency situation than the virus for a moment. How are you keeping going, you know, through your own networks and your own understanding of the community in which you're working? How are you managing during the pandemic as artists?
Honestly, for me, it gave me time to really get into building this work. The Conquest, I actually started this about 3 years ago, and I just wasn't quite ready to finish it. It'd been sitting in my office space for a while. I moved it to my home, and with the quarantine last year, I was able to slow down and get lost in the practice and start thinking and reading back on a lot of what influenced this body of work. So in my case, it's been really helpful for me to get back into my practice and start writing and making meaning of it and building on the body of work.
Thanks, Mary.
Collaboration has been what's saving my practice during pandemic. And it's funny that as a painter, I say that because before pandemic, all I want is people to leave me alone. And during pandemic, you're starting to feel the world is not that great a place if everybody leave you alone and the distancing becomes a given. So that was actually when I started actively reaching out and proposing project to friends and come up with a structure where we have studio date together and manipulating a concept that is a common interest of other, and pushing a slip of paper or idea back and forth. And so pandemic in a way shifted my practice to a more of a dialogue rather than a monograph.
And do you think post-pandemic, do you think there are elements of that practice that'll stay with you, or will you revert to pre-pandemic, Dan?
I think it will stay, but the need to be left alone will come back. So you become a parallel of a practice, one that intersect with other people's studio practice, one that you keep it to yourself.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. Who else would like to comment on their pandemic practice and what that means in terms of their community? Rachel?
Like Mary, it's given me a lot of time, which has been nice. A lot of studio time. There's not as many distractions because there's nothing else to do. I've also been becoming a little bit more self-sufficient in the studio. I've been making paintings more so than prints, using more different like paint strategies in combination with printmaking techniques, so that I can stay at my home studio for longer amounts of time. I don't have to go back and forth to school to use any of the equipment. Now, I had been kind of working in that direction for a while, but I think the pandemic kind of pushed me a little bit further in that direction. Now, that being said, spending more time by myself in the studio has been lovely, but I do miss the art community of DFW. I mean, luckily, a lot of the galleries are opening back up with some new protocols, but yeah, it is just, it's a hard it's been hard not having that art community.
Yeah, I think a lot of us will agree, certainly on that note, being able to be out and about and looking at a lot of art, having a lot of different experiences in that regard. Anybody else want to talk about their pandemic community? Cam?
I think it was became a motivating factor for my wife and I. We have a small space that we built years ago, but we never quite had the initiative to start it. And it was a small gallery space that faces the street. It's a walk-by gallery. So, and it is very much for the community. It's that sense of inserting this space into where we live. And the pandemic was like, oh, okay, now's the time to get started. And we started with the graduates last year who didn't have exhibitions, and we gave them first shows. And then we ended up doing an additional, I guess, 5, 6 exhibitions, projects. And yeah, it's been really great. It's forced us to kind of reach out to people that we've always wanted to show, put on these exhibitions and really engage with them and have an opportunity to see real art in real time, walking up, looking at it, waking up and seeing it across the street it was real important and good. So in that case, it was really a positive.
And certainly for our students to be able to experience that without, having to go through so many layers of protocol, to be able to kind of walk up and look at the work through the gallery window. It's just a really unique experience, and it really fits for this moment. And I could actually say Rachel hit on something that was sort of another question, a broader question that I have about the arts community, because I know in a way the art school is kind of like its own distinct community within this sort of wider regional North Texas arts community. And I know that you all as faculty work really hard to encourage our students to get involved and to network and to visit different galleries, to meet other artists and to become an active part of that community. And I know, as I say, that's what you're doing in your classes and with your students. And it's part of their sort of professional development, their art school experience. And I wondered if you could talk about, for you, what in an arts community is really important for you to help you sustain your practice and help you be successful. I know Rachel mentioned the opportunity of being able to visit a lot of different galleries and see a lot of work and connect with people that way. But what are other things that are important to you in terms of an artist community?
Well, I'd say, one of the most important things, especially for a young artist, is that it's a support group in every sense of the word. In terms of just the people that you're dealing with are going through the same thing you're dealing with. They're trying to figure out how to make work, how to continue to make work. They're trying to figure out how to get into the gallery system. They're trying to figure out all this stuff. And I got to say, as teachers, we all do our best in terms of sort of giving advice and encouragement in regards to that. But I can also tell you, from a student's point of view, being able to hear somebody other than your teacher say that is also really helpful to them. They don't think that person is saying it because that's what teachers say, right? They're saying it because it's their truth. So, that's one of the big things, I think, in terms of what that community outside of school does for them.
I think access to primary source materials is really important for the area, in addition to things that Rachel and Dick already covered. So we can experience a lot of things online and remotely. And for me, in terms of teaching and studio practice, the biggest thing that's been impacted is access to those primary sources. Going to a shared place of learning, like a library or an arcade, and looking at something that to me is very important and interesting, but maybe has not yet been deemed important enough to document online in high resolution or in multiple languages. So I think making, you know, a young student or young artist or anybody that is starting this new journey aware of what's available in your community, how to access it, and that what is not necessarily important to somebody may be really exciting for you and change your personal outlook.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking too from a curatorial perspective about studio visits. And, you know, while I love connecting with artists and being able to do virtual studio visits, I long for the day when I can travel and really sort of move around and do those, you know, hours and hours of spending time in a studio with an artist and really getting to know their work and picking up objects and looking at things really closely. So yeah, as Nick says, going back to those sort of original objects, the things that really matter, being able to do that again, having that access seems really important.
I think
Dan? Oh, sorry, Cam, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, so much of what we do as artists is we go and look and and all the things that are being said, but there's the periphery that becomes so important at the opening, the conversations you have, the introductions that are made, seeing people over and over, being at a lecture beforehand, seeing faces react. And I miss that for the students because, you know, you encourage them to go out and then you meet them there and they see you engaging, and it's just like, oh, this really is, again, back to that word, a community of people who support each other. And we all say it, it's like when you're present all the time, opportunity happens, and there's no way to be present now. You know, you can't virtually be present. And I think that's such an enormous loss for our graduates who are graduating and can't kind of dive right into it, and our undergraduates who want to participate. And it's that face-to-face that it's about the art, but it's also about all the activity around the art that becomes so supportive in a way.
Right, it's about those friendships or those relationships that last years, decades, ideas that are shared. You talked to Cam about your collaboration being, you know, many years. It's things like that you might, you know, talk to someone or have a conversation with them that is a set of ideas that doesn't kind of become anything till 10 years later. So community is also not just about the now, but it's about what will be and what could be in the future, certainly. Dan, did you have any further thoughts to that? Like what's sustaining you? What are the important things in an arts community that have to be there to sustain your practice?
I think everybody really said it. To just say it slightly differently, I felt like the art is really always about how do you integrate it into life and have it to circulate in your life as a part of a routine. So while Nick was saying be able to access primary resource, I'm reflecting on the time that me and my undergrad friend were going to show, but the best part comes from like stopping for pizza on the way back at Moudy Gallery opening, where finally things started to click and then you're starting to arguing and debating for the artists or what happened in the opening. That's where those moments that I would say like art becomes meaningful in the way that it's not really like the art under quotation mark in the art history book, but it's sort of lived through going to pizza joint. I think that's very important, and I think we're all missing that a little bit under pandemic. Just the art, but also all the non-secular moments is also important.
Yeah, food and art go well together, don't they?
Tell me about it.
As we know. But to take time to sit across the table and to talk about the thing that you've just seen or experienced, and to enjoy that moment and sort of interrogate it in a very sort of, you know, casual but obviously informed way. It's always really fun to do over food, to take time to do that for sure. Mary, did you have any other comment? What are the things that you need in an arts community to sustain?
Sure. Obviously, the support is critical. It's interesting, as Cam was speaking and he mentioned the things around the art. And I think about studio visits, of which a lot of times when I go in, especially when students invite me to look at their studios, a lot of times the dialogue is away from actually just looking at the art. There are things you will notice in that space, and ideas would emerge in that space that informs the artwork. And that's kind of lost, right? If you're doing it virtually or you're just looking at the finished product. So there's something nice about the dialogue around the art that informs the practice. And there's something wonderful about doing that in person, if it's one-on-one or small groups. That's something I need continuously to listen to myself too. As I'm in dialogue with someone, I find myself making sense of what I'm creating and why I'm creating, rather than just doing it in isolation. Writing about it is wonderful, but when you're in dialogue with someone, you're able to hear yourself and they're able to hear you too, and communicate to you what they're hearing. So.
And it becomes a sort of, you can have a challenging conversation in real time. Is it such a different experience than some writing a critical review or something of that nature? So yeah, I think certainly voices are really important. The speaking in real time are really important side by side. And just to flip things around for just a second, Kathryn, Emma, I wanted to throw the question kind of back to you as well, actually, as graduate students. What are the things that have kept you going through the pandemic? Because I understand you graduate students, that you are like a little community that work together, that support each other, that help each other out, and probably, challenge each other theoretically as well. What are the things that you're hearing from the faculty that are familiar to you in your student experience?
I think we've had to be really intentional with creating a community and also in supporting a community as students. We're all first years in the group that put together this faculty show. And so, personally, I just moved across the country basically to a new place. And you don't naturally have that inherent community that you have with your fellow students. You have to really try a lot harder. And so both with my fellow students and then with friends back home or where I was living in Washington, D.C., I've really come to rely upon technology and trying to be as intentional as possible. And even like, I'm definitely an introvert, but having to push myself and trying to have that community and that support system, which I think resonates probably with a lot of people as they're experiencing the pandemic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kathryn. I think it's been a little bit difficult just because everybody's online and we've seen each other maybe twice in person. But there's nothing quite like the scholarly community that you form when you're in your classes, and you get so many interesting and diverse viewpoints.
Thanks. Just wanted to bring you into that conversation. And I have one eye on the time as well. I know, do we have any questions that have come through in the chat that you would like me to follow through with, Emma?
Yes, there are a few questions.
Okay.
So I'm gonna start with the more specific ones. So the first one for Dick, you were also part of the nature panel for this exhibition. How do you see nature as a part of your community, or do you see them as two separate spheres?
Actually, they're not separate. They're all part of the same thing, as much as the group of photographers is as well. It's one of those interesting things in terms of nature. It's just thinking of it as community. I love going out and just being there and just looking and seeing, and that informs a lot of what I do. But I don't think of any of those activities as really truly kind of separate things. It's all part of the big circle of what we do.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mary, we have a question for you. I would love to hear more from Mary about her art disrupting the exclusionary tendencies of museum culture. Could she speak more on that, or perhaps the abstract imagery in her work?
Absolutely. I would like to speak on disruption because in this process, as an educator too, right, the question comes to mind. What are we teaching? What are we exposing to our students, right? Museums, that's a knowledge space, right? That's a space where audience learn about people, ideas, culture, histories, right? So the question becomes, if a narrative of a group of people is singular, which if you think about it, it doesn't really make sense, right? If a narrative of a group of people within any context is a singular narrative, what does that communicate to an audience? So the idea of disrupting it is to provoke questioning, is to look at something that seems familiar, but unfamiliar as well. It's to question, it's to ask, right? So again, the question becomes, and I would be curious, if I were to enter into an African art gallery in a huge museum and encounter a work like this, it's not the norm. And it's not the norm for a reason, right? So that idea of disrupting is to get to the point where to provoke us from, let's expand what this history is. Let's move beyond one aesthetic that represents a group of people. Let's attend to the real history. Let's include, where's the photography? Where's the painting? Where is the installations? And all these histories do exist. They're just not in the canon. So the idea of disrupting is to push that scholarship of what has been normalized. So it's more inclusive and it's more telling of the truth. It's more authentic, let's say that. Thank you.
Wonderful, Mary. Thank you so much. We do have one general one that I would like everybody to answer. How do you think the concept of community involves a visitor's interaction with your work? And let's start with you, Dick.
A visitor's interaction with my work. You know, that's an interesting question. We don't get to experience it that much, really. You know, we typically will have work in an opening and we'll have people who will come in and they'll react to it. And it's likely that may be the only time you actually have that moment, unless you bring individual people in to see the gallery. And so those events have been both instructional and horrifying in my life. You know, there've been good times and bad times in terms of those kinds of experiences. I will say, for the most part, they've been very good and really interesting.
Yes, absolutely. How do you think the concept of community involves a visitor's interaction with your work?
With my work specifically, I'm struggling with this one. I mean, when you go to an art exhibition, there is a sense of community. There's other people in the exhibition. Sometimes you're going with friends, with family members. We've heard already that there's like this informal discussion that happens. So I think viewing any artwork, no matter who makes it, there is a sense of community. I mean, it's on display. It's meant to be seen by more than one individual. But there's this interesting shift that happens, right? Because as an artist, you're making it as an individual. So I can make an artwork, but I don't necessarily have control over how it's seen, like what type of community sees it and in what environment. I mean, personally, again, I'm thinking about my connection to community is more through cultural references. So I would think that viewers of an exhibition would have a sense of community in recognizing some of those references.
Awesome, thank you. And to kind of maybe rephrase it a little bit, what would you like visitors to get out of your work, if anything, when they walk up to it? Is there something that you would like them to take away from it? Maybe that community aspect, the sort of implicit communication between the artist and the visitor.
Sure. I mean, I can add a little bit before passing the torch to the next person. Again, I mean, I would like people to kind of see a multitude of references that are made in my work and draw connections from those.
All right, Nick, you're up next.
It's difficult to imagine what somebody is bringing to that experience when they're looking at your work, but I would hope that some aspect of a shared cinematic memory is there when somebody might be experiencing for the first time something that I've made related to the works in the show, whether it's a connection to a specific time that they had a similar experience, or knowing someone who encountered that. But in general, just the kind of sliding scale between our own experiences, technology, and emotion. Those are kind of the things that I would hope make it into kind of their thought process at some point. But again, it's their turn, so I don't want to drive that and overwhelm them. And I think that's probably why a lot of the works that I'm making in that kind of arcade-based project strip away any and all graphics and just remain these kind of bare architectural voids that allow it to become a blank surface for somebody to kind of project whatever their specific shared cultural memory is.
Thank you. Mary?
In a way, this body of work needs the audience to view, to make sense of. I can't predict what that making sense of will be. A lot of times I'm actually more interested in hearing about what someone sees, what they're making sense of, and less about telling them. Because in that process, it allows me to learn too, right? It allows me to gauge if I'm making this work to provoke, to disrupt. What are they seeing? What are they making sense of? How are they engaging with this? A lot of times it's a push and pull, right? At first gaze, there's, oh, wow. And then as more time is spent with the work, it starts becoming more complicated, right? What is seen as beautiful becomes dangerous, or what is seen like, oh, beautiful colors can suddenly, like in the Conquest, right? You're getting closer and like, oh, is this blood? What is this? So the work needs the audience engagement. While I may aim for certain things to occur, I can't predict that, but I'm always interested in what they're taking and what they're seeing and what they're making sense of. I almost need to hear that for my own sake. And it's not necessarily going to transform or inform the work, but it's always interesting to see what you're creating, how it's received differently within different communities as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Dan?
I think when a piece of artwork or an object is in front of general audience, the artwork is sort of standing in for the artist, the creator, to initiate a conversation. And because artist is one individual, this conversation, and artist belong to artist, him, herself, or theyself is a member of the community. The conversation always have that element of speaking to the community that artists belong. And for instance, Mary's work or my work draws specific cultural reference, and that speaks to a certain group of audience. And of course, we also try to initiate universal conversation as well. I do think that artwork, they function as this agent to establish communication in different level. But the very first group of audience that you reach out to speak to is a member of our community. In that way, he participates, if the work speaks at all.
Thank you so much. Cam?
So I'm going to take a slightly different take on ours. So when we do a big project like this, that might take a year, 9 months to a year to make, we use nomenclatures to identify aspects of it. So each segment became a named element, and there's, there's 11 segments, and that fell into a theory of planetary science that there's 11 planets. And kind of early on, as we're dealing with each one, that's how we would identify it, by this the planet name. And we understood that there was one thing missing, and that was the sun. And all of a sudden the sun became the person viewing. So in all the drawings in the book, you'll always see the person standing there as the sun. And we were really aware of the fact that they were part of this system that we were building, this architectural element, this large installation. And so that, the viewer was almost mechanically part of the conversation from the beginning. Not at all. I mean, of course, we're thinking about what their experience would be, but they had a position within the construction of this, because there's, the team of the three of us who are the collaborators, but then there's another 5 people working with us kind of to develop these large projects. And so you need this kind of conversation going. And so in the planning stage and in the developing stage, that element was always part of the conversation. The height, where they would look, how they position themselves, all these kinds of things. So that's a slightly different take, but as we were working through that, literally the individual had a name, and that was the sun, and that was the point at the end, the narrow part of the cantilever. So we were how one moved around the space and interacted in their primary positions were intensely scrutinized and thought about in the process.
Thank you so much for that take. We are actually out of time. Kathryn?
Yes, so thank you everybody for your participation, both the audience and for each of you as our artists and our panel moderator. We really appreciate your participation, but then also just your thoughts about the art. It's fascinating for me as a student to have worked with my classmates to put together this this exhibition, and then we talked to you at the beginning of it, and now we're closing it out and talking to you at the end and seeing your perspective. So we had it was funny when Sarah opened with the question about if you agree with being placed in the community. It's kind of like, oh, are they going to agree or not?
It's always good to ask an artist about that.
At the end of the exhibition. But thank you all for your time today, and I hope you all have a great evening. That's it for our panel discussion and for our show.